So good morning. Welcome, everyone. I am Melinda Treadwell, the interim president here at Keene State College, and I am honored to offer a welcome on behalf of this incredible academic community and this beautiful campus on a sunny fall day. So I'm very glad the weather cooperated with us to have you join us on a day that really shines for Keene. Senator Hassan, thank you so much for your commitment to the important issues for this region of our state. I'm so grateful for it. And as you all know, we are here today for Senator Hassan's field hearing. This is an official field hearing with regard to broadband access. And as we all know, when we think about economic mobility for communities, there are very few issues as important as high-speed internet connectivity. And certainly for our region, one of the main reasons Keene State is thrilled to host this event and support you in this is that we appreciate deeply that our economic access for the future and our future success will be tied to high-speed internet connectivity. And I believe rural communities will be left behind if we cannot guarantee high-speed connectivity. So again, thank you, Senator Hassan, and I will step aside for the rest of your hearing. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, President Treadwell, and thank you to the entire Keene State community for hosting us today. The first thing I will do is call this hearing to order. This is an official hearing that will be recorded for the congressional record, and it is my distinct pleasure to be here today to call this hearing of the Commerce Committee to order. And I will start by also thanking Senator John Thune, who is the chairman of the Commerce Committee, and Senator Bill Nelson, our ranking member, for allowing this field hearing today. They and their staffs have been absolutely instrumental in orchestrating this hearing, and I am really grateful for their efforts. I'd also like to thank Keene State College, again, for hosting this event, and a special thank you to President Melinda Treadwell for her remarks just now and for all the work that everybody here did to make this happen. And thank you as well to our witnesses and everyone in attendance for being here this morning and for their attention and commitment to an issue that is absolutely critical to New Hampshire and communities across our country. A strong telecommunications infrastructure is critical to our state's economy, as well as the safety and prosperity of all Granite Staters. But too many communities face challenges in getting access to broadband. I know that connecting communities to broadband is a goal that we all share, and the Commerce Committee can do important work in this field. But as we continue our efforts in Congress and at the FCC, it is critical that we have conversations outside of Washington to be successful. That's why I'm really pleased that you all could join us here in New Hampshire today and that so many members of the public are here as well. As I travel across our state, I talk to businesses about their priorities and their challenges. And time and again, I hear from businesses here in the Monadnock region and up in the North Country in particular about the urgent need to strengthen our broadband infrastructure. Our people and businesses simply cannot compete in the 21st century innovation economy without broadband. And we must act now to address what's an urban-rural divide that has persisted in our country and in this state for far too long. Today's field hearing will serve as a forum to continue to inform our on-the-ground efforts here in New Hampshire. Your voices and your priorities will help provide critical evidence and context for me and for FCC Commissioner Rosenworcel as we make important decisions about rural connectivity. During my time as governor, I was proud to start a partnership aimed at enhancing access to high-speed broadband in New Hampshire schools. And in the Senate, I've joined with my Republican colleague, Senator Gardner, in authoring the Airwaves Act, which would create a spectrum pipeline for our country to avoid what experts call a spectrum crunch. Spectrum is the finite resource that powers broadband connectivity, and we'll need a lot more of it to meet the needs of the 21st century economy. Beyond spectrum, we also must make meaningful and immediate investments where it counts. There is bipartisan discussion in Washington about a possible infrastructure package coming forward from this administration. It's essential that any infrastructure package must include broadband build-out and investment. Finally, we have to work to ensure that our networks are resilient. As we've seen with the storms that devastated Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas, there is an immediate need to ensure that when networks go down, we have solid plans in place to build them back up or stand up backup power sources so that individuals can connect to resources and to their loved ones. I hope this hearing will provide a platform to discuss these important issues and hope to learn more about the challenges currently facing our state when it comes to broadband. I know that we have many experts from our state who have provided written testimony, including Chris Rand from Granite State Communications, Joshua Meehan of Keene, and State Senator Jay Kahn. And I look forward to continuing to work together. I'd also like to acknowledge that all of today's remarks and this written testimony will become a part of the congressional record. So with this in mind, I'd like to introduce our first witness, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, for her statement. Welcome, Commissioner.
Good morning. To everyone here, and especially Senator Hassan, thank you for having me here in the Granite State. I am a New England native, so the opportunity to come up here and join you is both an honor and a treat. Now, back in Washington, I have the privilege of serving as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. I have a front row seat at the digital revolution, and every day I see how technology is changing every aspect of our civic and commercial life. Every day I am reminded that the future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live in this country, you are going to need access to modern communications for a fair shot at 21st century success. But the fact of the matter is that too many Americans lack access to broadband. This includes 23 million Americans living in rural communities, and it includes 15% of those living in rural New Hampshire. This is unacceptable, and we need to do better. But I don't think statistics like those tell the whole story. So to get a picture of just what it means to be consigned to the wrong side of the digital divide, I want to talk for a moment about something maybe unexpected. I want to talk about kids and homework. Today, 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires broadband access. Whoa, there we are. But data from the FCC show that 1 in 3 households do not subscribe to broadband service. And where those numbers overlap is what I call the homework gap. And according to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, the homework gap is real. By their estimate, 12 million children all across the country live in households without internet access. And I'm certain that some of them are right here in New Hampshire. Because I've heard from students in Texas who do homework at fast food restaurants with fries because it's the only place they know where they can get a free Wi-Fi signal. And I've spoken to high school football players in New Mexico who linger in the school parking lot after their games in the pitch black dark, holding their devices because it's the only place they know to get a reliable connection. These kids have grit, but it shouldn't be this hard. Because today, no child can be left offline. Developing digital skills is flat out essential for education and the modern economy. So I hope that adds a human dimension to what it means to not have access to broadband. And now let's talk a little bit about what we can do about it. First, if we want to get serious about addressing our broadband problems, we need to know exactly where those problems are most pronounced. We need better mapping. Nearly 9 years ago, in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, Congress had a good idea. It created a national broadband map, identifying where deployment had and had not occurred. But if you check that map out right now online, you'll find that it was last updated more than 3 years ago. And I don't have to tell you that in the internet age, 3 years is an eternity. So I think it's time for a national broadband map that offers an honest and current picture of wired and wireless broadband all across the country. Now, we can build that map in Washington with a whole bunch of data, but I also think it would be great if we had a clearer picture on the ground. I am a big believer in the wisdom of crowds, so I think we should put it to the public. And if you've not been able to get service or live in an area that lacks it, help us at the FCC make a map that reflects your experience and write us at broadbandfail@fcc.gov. I've set up that email account to take in ideas, and I am going to share every one of them with the chairman and my colleagues and put on the pressure to do something about it. Finally, I want to point out that connectivity matters not just on the ground, but in the skies. Wireless service is an essential part of our digital age infrastructure. For decades, the FCC has led the world with its auction models for the distribution of spectrum licenses. We've made a lot of progress powering the mobile devices that so many of us have come to rely on every day. But take a drive along some rural roads, probably not that far from here, and you'll know that there's room for improvement. It's one reason why the Airwaves Act that Senator Hassan and Senator Garden have put forward is so important. It helps identify more licensed and unlicensed spectrum and make sure we bring it to market in a timely way because it has deadlines. On top of that, it sets up a fund whereby auction revenues will help support wireless broadband infrastructure in rural communities. That's the kind of creative effort that would help in time lead to more coverage on a broadband map and also help close the homework gap. So thank you for having me here today. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joshua Sear, who is the Director of Education and Acceleration at Alpha Loft. Welcome, Mr. Sear.
Good morning and thank you. Thank you, Senator Hassan, for convening this field hearing and inviting me. Again, my name is Joshua Sear. I'm the Director of Education and Acceleration at Alpha Loft, a nonprofit that aids founders of innovative startups here in New Hampshire. My job includes developing and running our education programs for early stage startups, as well as running our startup accelerator. Previously, I've been a software developer for a tech company, and I'm now a technology advocate in the Seacoast area. I regularly run tech meetups, symposiums, and other events promoting education around new tech for both technologists and the general public. I've also been able to experience just a little bit of politics and policy over the last 2 years as I'm finishing my first term as a city councilor for the city of Portsmouth. I've pondered the topic of broadband in New Hampshire quite a bit, primarily from a perspective of business and consumer need, state health, and a vision of what's to come. And I'd like to relay to you 3 areas of concern that I have. First is a lack of broadband turns away those who are working the hardest to attract. New Hampshire, like other states, has an aging population, and it's creating numerous critical issues for our state. Lack of high-speed internet exacerbates the problem and frustrates our efforts in attracting and retaining younger generations. When it comes to making a decision on where to live, broadband plays a key role. Comcast recently surveyed apartment managers about the most important amenities for decision-making. A highlight of the report was that high-speed internet and Wi-Fi are among the most important factors for apartment dwellers when making a decision, even more than in-room laundry facilities. In addition to highly valuing broadband use is also dramatically higher with younger generations. In 2011, the average 18 to 24-year-old millennial consumed 25 hours of traditional TV per week. Today, they consume closer to 14. Ages 17 and under watch between 2 and 4 hours of YouTube and less than an hour of traditional TV per day. People are not just consuming video. Remote work has become a viable option for many. Frequently, this requires use of bandwidth-intensive tools such as Google Hangouts, FaceTime, Skype, WebEx, etc. This is required for professionals, and it means that they must move to where broadband is adequate and rule out the many areas in our state that it is not. Finally, more and more people are streaming their own personal activities as video for others to watch. This is in the form of streamed video game playing, performances, talk shows, Facebook Live, and more. This interactive format requires reliable upload speeds as well. Today, it is not unusual for a family to be consuming multiple bandwidth-intensive applications at the same time in many rooms of the home, and we simply cannot measure bandwidth needs by the use of just one application or even a few. Second area I'm concerned about is that consumers are confused and mobile broadband isn't adequate. It may seem like the answer to rural broadband is mobile access. However, the current unlimited plans are not really unlimited in the sense that a consumer would likely expect. Mobile plans will deprioritize data after a user hits a certain threshold in a given month. This varies by carrier in the 20 to 30 gigabyte range, as I've seen recently. This cap can hit very quickly on mobile devices. After that, the speeds slow down. Speeds also change when tethering to desktop TV, becoming far slower. Mobile speeds, availability, and reliability are simply not adequate as a primary source for internet for consumers. And finally, our future is full of heavy bandwidth uses not yet considered in places we do not expect. Humans are not good at planning for the future. Most are not aware that autonomous cars are literally just around the corner. we haven't done a good job in taking into account the many changing dynamics that come into play with this hugely disruptive event. For example, once we're no longer focused on the task of driving, entirely new forms of auto entertainment will emerge. The cars are remarkably well created as an entertainment hub, a captive audience, lots of speakers, plenty of room for screens. We don't yet know the kind of entertainment consumption that will be popular, but strong contenders include live video, movies, AR, VR. We can guess, however, that much of it will be bandwidth intensive while the car is in motion. Another example of anticipated future demands is the explosion in interest in the implementation of IoT, the Internet of Things. IoT is common enough now that it isn't a term used by consumers. As consumers, we simply expect that our devices are smart and can communicate with each other. While much of our current IoT devices consume and produce very little data, that doesn't mean the future will be the same. With numerous efforts underway for smart cities, are we leaving our less urban infrastructure behind? For these reasons and more, when thinking about broadband availability, we should be thinking about complete coverage, not simply covering destination zones. In summary, we're not meeting today's needs for many citizens in New Hampshire. Our planning for the future must take into account that the needs in the future will be significantly greater in terms of both data consumption and creation. The geographic areas covered must be profoundly greater than they're covered today. If people can't get what they need, they will move to areas that can serve them, furthering the migration to urban centers, and this will make the economics of serving rural areas even more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sear. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mike Reed, who is the State President for Consolidated Communications. Welcome and thank you for participating today, Mr. Reed.
And good morning. I'm Mike Reed. As the Senator said, I'm the State President for Northern New England for Fairpoint Communications, now Consolidated Communications. In that role, I'm responsible for government regulatory, public relations, and economic development in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And I really appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the importance of broadband in New Hampshire. Senator Hassan's assertion is undisputed. Access to the internet is vital in today's economy. Consolidated Communications may be a new name to some of you, but together with its recent acquisition of Fairpoint, both companies have a long history of delivering service to rural communities. The combined companies, Fairpoint Consolidated, employ 4,400 employees, is the 9th largest fiber optic provider in the country, spanning 36,000 fiber route miles in its 24-state network. We applaud Senator Hassan's goal to further investment in broadband deployment in rural communities through efforts like the introduction of the Airwaves Act. The advancement of wireless broadband access will still need to be supported by a very robust wireline backbone infrastructure. We have a very robust network backbone in this state, and Consolidated Fairpoint operates that backbone. In New England, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, we have about 19,000 miles of fiber in service today. My goal of speaking with you today is to describe some of the expansion and technology upgrades that have already occurred in rural New Hampshire, including the North Country and the Monadnock region, to meet the growing demands. At the same time, we want to ask that your efforts to stimulate broadband investment be focused on how best to spend limited federal dollars to provide service to the still unserved, especially in the most rural areas, making sure we don't overbuild existing networks to provide more options to people who already have access. Just as a couple examples, a few examples of what has been going on in New England or in New Hampshire specifically, we have Fairpoint in New Hampshire has 7,200 miles of fiber across the state. We've increased maximum residential broadband speeds to about 25 meg in most markets, 50 in some selected markets, and in the Portsmouth area, a gig. We've upgraded our switching offices, our central offices, switching offices. We have about 120 in New Hampshire. We have Ethernet service to each one of those offices where we can offer business, education, government, healthcare, up to 10 gig of service. We've increased internet available to locations in our footprint from 63% back in 2008 to about 96% today. And we built fiber to the wireless towers. There's about 400 wireless towers in New Hampshire that are served by Fairpoint Consolidated. In addition to this construction, we've accepted the Connect America Fund 2 money. That's very important to rural New Hampshire, rural New England. We've accepted a little over $4 million a year to build and maintain 13,131 locations in areas of New Hampshire identified by the federal mapping. I'm very happy to report that we're right on schedule. We're right on schedule with that. The goal, the milepost is 40% complete by the end of 2017, and we're right on target for that. We're ahead of target on that. We also agreed as part of the Fairpoint Consolidated acquisition to the commitment to spend the capital expenditure dollars, the average that we've had for the last few years, for the next 3 years. And in addition to that, we've targeted an extra $1 million specifically at improving service quality in areas of the state. That also is for the next 3 years. One thing I'm very proud of, we established a community broadband development team. We've worked with 45 communities here in New Hampshire. The total's about 200 communities across Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, actually with the Keene community. The goal of this team, they work with the communities to provide information about broadband, what the community's needs are, what they have for existing service, and we map it for the community, where the fiber is, what speeds are available in what areas of their community, and share with them everything we know about what's coming in our company. Here's a CAF project that's coming to your, and we think it's going to be built approximately this time period. The unserved locations we have are not unserved because we like to deny service. It's because they're harder to serve and they're more expensive. We know where the locations are. And with that information, we can identify where resources and collaboration is needed. It's imperative that the federal dollars that we may find are used to expand our network and be very careful not to duplicate something that's already there. Unnecessarily overbuilding existing facilities can actually hinder future investment in the private sector. That's critical. Private sector provisioning of broadband clearly demonstrates that worthwhile investment can and is being made in the nation's broadband infrastructure. These private sector efforts should be fostered and complemented by whatever we need now from local, state, or federal policy. Overall improvement of broadband infrastructure will require spending government funds wisely and providing incentives and support to help move the private investment along. In conclusion, I want to thank Senator Hassan for inviting me to testify today and assure you that Consolidated is committed to moving broadband expansion further in New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. And next, we'll hear from Mr. Brian Shepard, the Director of Broadband Services for the University of New Hampshire. Welcome, Mr. Shepard, and thank you for participating.
Thank you, Senator Hassan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak before you on this committee. In my role at the University of New Hampshire, I'm responsible for the university system's fiber-based wide area network that serves all of the USNH institutions, the community college system, as well as a number of community anchor institutions. I will share that New Hampshire's broadband providers have made significant progress over the past few years, but we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that all of our community anchor institutions, businesses, and residents have access to fast, reliable, and affordable necessary broadband. My past work in this area has provided some insights into ways that we can improve access and streamline deployment. So I'm here to recommend improving pole attachment rules, continued funding for broadband mapping and planning, and leveraging the E-rate program. The first topic is pole attachments. So New Hampshire's Public Utilities Commission Chapter 1300 rules regulate the pole attachment process in New Hampshire. As a component of the BTOP project that I managed, we hung fiber on over 24,000 poles in the state, which highlighted a significant area requiring improvement. Once that pole attachment fee has been paid to the pole owners, the make-ready process consists of the pole owner lowering their own cable plant and then coordinating with each of the existing third-party attachers to move their own cable plant in a lengthy and potentially costly sequential process. And I attached a diagram on page 4. The PUC rules require the pole owners to complete their make-ready work within 150 days, and each one of the third-party attachers is allowed to set their own just and reasonable rates for their individual moves based on make-ready rules that are not really clearly defined. As we prepare for the next decade of technology, it's critical that we streamline the pole attachment process. The upcoming transition to 5G LTE will likely place even greater demand on the poles, and the pole attachment process, as microcells will utilize both the top of the poles and the communication space for backhaul. While the pole attachment issues exist in most states, they can be minimized by implementing the concept of one-touch make-ready. I wanted to see if anything got lobbed at me for saying that. Certified construction crews are allowed to simultaneously make all the necessary changes to a utility pole to make it ready for a new attachment. This streamlines the make-ready process, shortens the timeline, and reduces the cost for both existing and new entrants, since it only takes one truck roll, one police detail, and one scheduler to accomplish that work. Like New Hampshire, a number of the states also legislate their own pole attachment rules. Perhaps the FCC rules should be amended to require that those states meet or exceed the FCC timetables for pole owners and third-party attachers. The next topic is broadband mapping and planning, which the commissioner spoke to. We have found that our work in this area has been challenged by the low resolution of the data that's collected as part of this, as one home served in a census block shows that the entire census block has been served. We propose that providers be required to submit address-level service data so that the estimates of availability are not overstated. In addition, there's considerable delay between when the data are submitted to the FCC and when they are made publicly available. This has resulted in efforts to enhance broadband in some areas where the providers claim have already been served because of that delay. And we also find there's a lack of full participation by some providers, and we're not sure why there's no recourse for them not having to provide that data. The planning and outreach component of our broadband mapping and planning program is challenged by a lack of resource. Since these programs offer data and resources which are critical to making informed decisions around broadband issues, ideally there'd be funds made available to continue that type of program in each state going forward. The next topic is E-rate, and over the past 2 years, the FCC's E-rate modernization program has placed an emphasis on high-speed connections in schools and libraries. However, there's still some ambiguity related to the providers trying to add additional strands and hitting other community anchor institutions and businesses along the path to that school. Allowing the utilization of an E-rate funded project to be the catalyst for further broadband expansion is a win for everybody. So I'd recommend that the USAC legislation be reviewed and clarified to allow and even encourage providers to be allowed to pay the uplift costs should they decide to provide fiber to additional community anchor institutions along the way. And finally, I recommend that any future federal funding be focused on the construction of high-capacity scalable networks. Fiber clearly has the greatest long-term scalability, so funding projects that push fiber out closer to the rural neighborhoods and then leverage existing copper infrastructure and wireless infrastructure to complete the last mile would provide a suitable interim plan until fiber is ultimately deployed every place. So I thank you for your opportunity to present to you today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shepard. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Grant Spellmeyer, who is Vice President for Federal Affairs and Public Policy at U.S. Cellular. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to attempt to talk today a little bit about the wireless side of the equation in broadband deployment. U.S. Cellular has served New Hampshire since 1988. We employ more than 100 people and have several hundred towers constructed across the state. My written testimony has a lot of stuff in it about the benefits of broadband and the job not being done. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on that here today. You can read that. I instead would offer 3 major points. The first one is that the job of broadband deployment is expensive, and it's not much more complicated than that. U.S. Cellular has used universal service funding over the last decade to deploy more than 1,000 towers across the United States, many of them in rural areas like New Hampshire. I will tell you that the cost to construct a tower on average exceeds $400,000 for us. That's expensive. When you focus on a state like New Hampshire and the experiences that we've had, it's quite common for us to spend more than $1 million to construct a tower in a mountainous area. A lot of that is driven by costs to put roads in, to bring in fiber backhaul. It's an extremely expensive proposition. And in many areas, the customer density simply isn't high enough to afford or to warrant $1 million investment. And we need to make those choices very carefully. If you look at page 8 of my written testimony, you'll see a map, and I know you can't really see it here today, but it shows the FCC's estimate last year of the areas of the country that still lack 4G broadband service from wireless providers. If you could see New Hampshire, you'd see that the FCC identified that there was a problem in the very northern part of the state, but that's it. The data that's been there to date shows that the job is done. I know that's not true. I saw it this morning as I drove over from Manchester, carrying phones from multiple providers. I applaud Commissioner Rosenworcel's call earlier in her testimony to solicit consumer input. I know that the consumers know that the job's not done. So let me talk for a minute about the job that remains. Assuming this inaccurate map is in fact accurate, we know the job's at least $20 billion to finish it across rural America. And that's an awful lot of money. Now, the good news is that the FCC has created something called Mobility Fund 2. They've devoted $4.5 billion over the next decade to try to fix that gap, but you know, $4.5 million is not, or $1 billion, falls far short of the $20 billion that we believe is needed to do the job. And I hate to tell you, but it's going to get worse. There was a reference to 5G, the next generation of mobile technology that's going to make those autonomous cars a reality. The challenge in most experts' opinion is that you're going to need a whole lot more towers to deliver 5G, and this rural-urban divide is only going to get worse. I think at that point it will be unacceptable to everyone. So I hate analogies, but somebody was reminding me of the famous scene from the movie Jaws, where Roy Scheider's on the boat and he looks at the captain after seeing the shark and he says, "Captain, you're going to need a bigger boat." I believe that's what we're dealing with here. Fundamentally, we need a bigger boat. Bold action is needed. First, as I call for in my testimony, we need to pass the Airwaves Act, Senate Bill 1682. It will bring that spectrum that is needed by the wireless industry, and it will set aside 10% of the proceeds to help deal with the cost issues that I've talked about. And I hope the Senate moves quickly to adopt that bill. In addition, the second half of that is the infrastructure package. Senator, you talked about it in your opening. Certainly a significant portion of that needs to go to broadband deployment. Estimates have been that there'll be $1 trillion in that package. If we can get a small portion of that set aside for broadband deployment, we'll go a long ways to getting that boat. The third item I wanted to talk about briefly, and I won't dwell on it, is something kind of arcane, but it's called contribution reform. The universal system is in trouble. It's funded based upon interstate revenues. Those revenues continue to decline as the world has moved to internet. And for a bunch of technical reasons, it's going to run out of money in the next few years if somebody doesn't deal with it. And so we certainly support efforts at the commission. I know Commissioner Rosenworcel's been involved in those efforts for a long time, trying to fix that. And we urge Congress at some point to pay attention to it as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spellmeyer. And now to Mr. Tom Strickland, who is president and co-owner of Sequoia Technologies. Good morning, and again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being a great business in New Hampshire.
Good morning. Senator Hassan, thank you for this opportunity to come before you and the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee to share my experiences as a technology provider helping other businesses in northern New England succeed in the information age. I'm president and co-owner of Sequoia Technologies Group in Peterborough. I have been in the technology industry since 1978 in roles ranging from software development to infrastructure management and consulting. I also served on the board of New Hampshire Fast Roads, which built a fiber optic open network to provide middle mile and last mile services in rural areas of western New Hampshire. Sequoia was formed in 2002 and provides comprehensive technology services to businesses headquartered in northern New England and to their regional offices throughout the country. For most of our clients, we manage every aspect of their technology and are often directly involved in recommending, procuring, and managing broadband services for our clients. Thus, we are intimately familiar with the challenges of obtaining these services in our area. Quality high-speed broadband has become as essential to business growth today as rivers were in the 18th and 19th centuries and as interstate highways were in the 20th. Some of the largest and most successful businesses in the U.S. don't sell any physical products. Virtually everything that Google and Netflix sells is delivered over the internet. These businesses could be located anywhere that people want to live and work and where quality broadband is available. And while it is true that these established businesses have the resources to build high-speed internet virtually anywhere they choose, the next Google or Netflix will only locate where high-speed internet already exists. My own business could not exist without the internet. Even businesses that ship physical products depend on the internet to connect with their customers, their suppliers, and the advanced cloud technologies that can give them a competitive advantage. Over the last 30 years, the internet has evolved from a science network used only by geeks to a utility service that businesses depend on. Unfortunately, that rapid evolution of technology has outpaced the regulatory framework needed to keep it running efficiently and ensure that all businesses compete on an equal footing. I want to recount specific instances where the lack of broadband regulation has caused significant problems in obtaining service. During the New Hampshire Fast Roads network deployment, we frequently encountered sluggish responses to pole permit requests when those poles were owned by competing services. Regulations to prevent this type of obstruction would encourage network growth and competition. Lack of universal service for broadband has resulted in balkanization of the market and leaves small towns at a disadvantage when negotiating service agreements with carriers. For example, one of my employees lives in Rindge, New Hampshire, in an area with about 100 homes. His area is separated from most of Rindge by a lake, and there is no land route to the rest of Rindge where cable internet is provided by Argent Communications. However, he's a half mile from Comcast service in Jaffrey. My employee won't be served by either of these carriers because Argent can't cross into Jaffrey and Comcast can't cross into Rindge. As a result, he and his 100 neighbors are limited to DSL service that performs poorly. Lack of transparency makes it difficult to determine which carriers can serve a particular location and delays installation. Most carriers consider their network maps to be intellectual property and do not share them. Thus, we must inquire of each carrier and wait for field surveys to be completed. One of our clients is a power plant in the center of Berlin, New Hampshire. When the plant came online in 2013, we had to wait several months for a fiber optic line to be extended to them. And during that time, the plant had to rely on cellular internet service that was expensive and slow. This same lack of transparency impacts the cost of construction when infrastructure must be extended. I've received quotes ranging from $0 to $50,000 to extend cable internet less than a quarter mile along a state highway. These quotes were from the same carrier in locations 2 miles apart. Just this morning, we received a quote of $6,700 to extend service about 200 yards. Kimball Physics was started in Wilton, New Hampshire 40 years ago by a group of physicists from MIT and employs 70 well-paid high-tech workers. They produce electron optics that are used to manufacture most of the high-density integrated circuits worldwide. When they started the business, internet service wasn't necessary. Today, it is essential, but because of their rural location, they are faced with spending $250,000 to extend fiber optic service to their facility. An established, successful business can afford that and might choose to do so in order to stay here and keep the quality of life they value. New businesses will look elsewhere, and these high-pay, low-impact businesses are the ones we want. Businesses need high-quality, low-latency connections with service-level guarantees and symmetric bandwidth delivery. Unfortunately, many in rural areas have no choice other than consumer-grade service, which is inadequate for access to the cloud services their competitors in other areas take for granted. In the state of New Hampshire, towns are prohibited from bonding to build broadband infrastructure. A community that wishes to solve the broadband problem for itself cannot reasonably do so. The lack of a regulatory framework at the federal level to ensure universal and equitable service for everyone, combined with state-level prohibitions on bonding, leaves the people and businesses of New Hampshire at an unfair disadvantage when competing with the rest of the nation. In conclusion, I encourage the committee to act quickly to establish the regulatory framework needed to encourage the deployment of broadband infrastructure to New Hampshire and to the rest of the United States. Our businesses need these services to flourish and compete with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strickland. I do have a number of questions that are really intended to help us delve a little bit deeper into the topics that you all have raised so well, and I am very, very grateful for such comprehensive and thoughtful testimony. And what I will do as I raise questions is I'll tend to direct the question to a panelist or two, but I will try also to give you all opportunity if there's something you want to add after I've asked a couple of people. So if for some reason I don't notice that you're interested in addressing something, feel free to be vigorous, and we will make sure that we hear from everybody. And people should know, too, that because this is a congressional hearing, we will limit the questioner to me, but we have asked people from the community for questions as well, and I will be raising some questions on behalf of community members so that we can get those in the record. And you'll hear at the end of the hearing the process for keeping the record of this congressional hearing open for 10 days so people can comment further. So I want the community to know I started in public life in the New Hampshire State Senate, and what we would do in the New Hampshire State Senate is members of the community would sign in and be asking questions themselves. So this is an adjustment for Granite Staters, and I'm very appreciative of everybody who is here and hope very much that if you have follow-up questions, you will submit them to us. My first question concerns the Airwaves Act that Senator Gardner and I have co-sponsored. And I'll start with this question to you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. First of all, again, thank you for coming. I wanted to get your feedback on the importance of the Airwaves Act, which I introduced earlier this year with Senator Gardner. This bipartisan legislation would enact a spectrum pipeline to meet the needs of a 5G America. Would provide additional unlicensed spectrum to benefit our nation's entrepreneurs and innovators, and the Airwaves Act would make meaningful investments in rural broadband. Can you elaborate on what this bill can do for the United States and particularly for rural America?
Thank you. And again, thank you for having me here. Coming home is like, it's not a hardship assignment. All right. The most important infrastructure we have today is invisible. You don't see it. It's the airwaves all above us. It is how we are building our wireless future. And Congress and the Federal Communications Commission participate in the zoning of those airwaves. And if we figure out how to organize them in a way that we can cram more activity into our skies, we will all be better off. Our devices will work in more places. We will have more things that are connected in ways that will make us more effective and efficient. And the first thing we need to do to make that happen is get more spectrum to market. And it might seem to be a simple thing, but I think the greatest benefit of the Airwaves Act is the fact you put deadlines on getting that spectrum to market. Just talking about it is nice, but putting deadlines on getting that spectrum into market will make an enormous difference in rural and urban America.
Well, thank you. Mr. Spellmeyer, can you talk a little bit about your company's work to begin to plan for and deploy 5G? How does the wireless industry generally view the importance of 5G to our nation's wireless networks?
Thank you, Senator. Certainly, U.S. Cellular and all the major wireless carriers are busily working, preparing for the arrival of 5G. Testing is underway. U.S. Cellular has has done some testing, extensive discussions with manufacturers. Some of the largest carriers actually have field tests underway. So we need equipment that works. We need access to the spectrum. Some of that's been auctioned. Some of it will be auctioned. If the Airwaves Act gets passed, more of it will become available on tight timeframes. That's going to all have to come together. As I said in my oral comments, I think the biggest challenge for the arrival of 5G in rural America is the significant need for new towers, 5, 10, 15-fold over what exists today. And the economics of that are really going to be the biggest barrier to its arrival in most of New Hampshire.
Well, thank you. One of the purposes of the Airwaves Act is to make sure that the United States can maintain its leadership in advanced wireless networks. Can you comment on why that's so important?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons, but I think the biggest of which is for device availability. We've been active in the global, there's a whole set of global standard setting bodies that deal with the operation of spectrum across the globe. And we need international harmony with what's going on around the world so that device manufacturers like Apple can build affordable devices that work everywhere.
Thank you. Mr. Sear, I wanted to touch base with you because, as we know, 5G networks will bring with them lower latency and higher capacity. Many believe these benefits will be particularly important for the Internet of Things and other sensing technologies. Do you expect startups to take advantage of these networks in the near future?
Oh, absolutely. I think, for any startup, you find what the problem is, and then you create a solution for that, right? And so there's so many problems have been identified, and we're just simply waiting for the technology to catch up so that we can produce that solution. So I have no doubt that there's going to be a strong demand for that.
Thank you. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment about the Airwaves legislation?
I will just add, Senator, that as Mr. Spellmeyer needs more towers, we have to make sure that we have the internal infrastructure in the state to serve those towers.
Yeah.
Those towers require they require fiber. And they're on the mountain, and they're not inexpensive to build. But we have the core base in our state available today. We will just continue to enhance that and expand it as needed to serve those towers. That's a critical piece.
Thank you. Anyone else? I will move on to the subject of network resiliency. And again, I'll start with you, Commissioner. We've had an unbelievably difficult and challenging hurricane season. And while the impacts of those recent hurricanes are still weighing very heavily on many of our hearts and minds, I'd like to talk a little bit about emergency preparedness and network resiliency. What is the FCC doing to ensure that our networks are resilient and that the cable, phone wires, and fiber is secure?
Thank you. This is an important question. We're doing some things. I think we should be doing more, because if you've seen those images of what the wind and rain have done in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, you realize Mother Nature can be awfully destructive. Yeah. And I think it is incumbent on the FCC now to understand what the impact of these weather events has been on our nation's networks. Because one thing's clear to me, we do not have recovery if we don't recover communications. And so I've asked for the agency to hold field hearings in these locations so that we can learn from these events and make sure we take that knowledge about best practices for network resiliency and recovery and put them to work. Because one thing's for sure, we are definitely going to have other weather events in the future, and what we can learn from these events that have just occurred is really important.
Thank you. And I know from our office's perspective, dealing with constituents who had medical emergencies after these hurricanes hit, and the limitations of communications because of the devastation on the networks really prevented absolutely critical communication about medical events, among many other things. So I agree with you that field hearings would be a really important way for the commission to begin to understand the impact of these weather events. What do you hope as a regulator, Commissioner, that communication companies are doing about resiliency as they design and build their networks? Do you think, and let me just add, what do you expect from the communications companies, and then also what kind of consumer education do we need along with that about resiliency issues?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much in that question. Let me just point out something, though, that's simple and fundamental. More of our networks now rely on commercial power than ever before.
Yeah.
It used to be that if we had a hurricane or a big snowstorm and everything failed, you could pick up your copper line and your telephone and it would work.
Yeah.
But now, we've got to charge, we've got to stay charged, we've got to make sure that our cell towers have power too.
Right.
And so what we have is a more powerful communication system, but it is more reliant on commercial power.
Right.
So figuring out how we all better prepare for it with solar charger backup batteries is important from the consumer perspective. And from the provider perspective, we need to figure out, especially in storms and the like, how we make sure that there are backup generators that are available and that those providers of service get priority for getting fuel when there's an emergency and we need recovery.
Thank you. Mr. Reed and Mr. Spellmeyer, how do you build resiliency into your networks as you deploy and maintain connectivity in New Hampshire? Mr. Reed,
Okay.
why don't you go first?
I can start that. I mean, our network originated in the original Bell system, and it is built to be very resilient. The improvements in the technology, I mentioned in New Hampshire, we have 120 switching offices. They all have backup, emergency backup, immediate battery power, and then a generator that will last for as long as it needs to. Many of the remote locations, as we're expanding our network further and further out, if you need faster speeds, we have to move that switching equipment closer to you. And as the speeds increase, for example, 50 over 20 is about 1,600 feet on copper, 1,650 feet. So as these remotes move further and further out, many of them have battery backup power as well. Some have permanent generators, some have portable generators that we move as needed. Almost as more important than that is the design of the network for the resiliency. Self-healing rings, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are all tied together. Somebody mentioned Berlin. I think we go right up through Rangeley, Maine, over through Errol into Berlin. That's part of the network that ties those three states together, as well as diverse routes. We have to, once we have service in the state, we have to get to the world. Yeah. So we go to Boston, we go to New York City. So there's multiple avenues, but design of the network for that redundancy and then the emergency backup power has always been a very key issue in our business.
Thank you, and Mr. Spellmeyer.
So for U.S. Cellular, we're lucky enough, I can say, that we were not directly impacted by any of the recent hurricanes that hit the southern states. However, we certainly have dealt with hurricanes in the past, and the flooding last year in West Virginia and the wildfires that are going on in the West right now. It's a continuing challenge for wireless carriers. Following Hurricane Katrina, the FCC adopted rules that required wireless carriers to provide backup battery and power to cell sites. Those rules were subsequently challenged in court. While that court challenge was ongoing, U.S. Cellular made the decision that we would nonetheless proceed and to put backup battery power on each and every one of our cell sites across the country, and I think that number is in excess of 6,000. So we have what we think is a industry-leading backup plan in place, and we see it when we experience outages, that they're minimized. And we're very proud of that, and it's served us well, and I think that's why we're able to attract and maintain customers. That said, there certainly are challenges even to that. I know when Hurricane Sandy hit a couple of years ago, there were plenty of stories about carriers mainly in urban markets, running on diesel generators, but those diesel generators require fuel. And there were plenty of stories about, carriers not being able to get fuel to backup power sources, in some instances because it was commandeered by the National Guard for other purposes, and all kinds of stuff. So it's a very complex equation, but we're proud of the work that we've done.
Well, thank you, and I'll follow up a little bit just because it strikes me that states like New Hampshire can pose some particular challenges on the resiliency front, just in terms of the wide range of weather events that we can have. So on the one hand, we are talking about hurricanes right now. On the other hand, blizzards can also present a particular kind of challenge. Are there differences in terms of what you have to prepare for in these various kinds of weather challenges? And do states with this kind of variation in weather pose particular problems?
Yes, they do. I'm not sure I'm equipped to give you the world's best answer on
Fair
all of those differences,
Yeah.
but we see, I think some of it's dependent upon, we serve Oklahoma, where the tornadoes come
Right.
out of nowhere with no notice.
Yeah.
We serve mountain areas where, you may have 3 days warning that a
Yeah.
storm is coming, and you'll see our network guys go out and deploy fuel to generators and put things in place. So it's a variety of different factors. Certainly these hurricanes that hit the Caribbean look like they just wiped the ground clean.
Yeah. And Mr. Reed, do you want
Sure,
to?
I can add to that. I mean, we talked about, Mr. Shepherd here mentioned poles. That's one of the reasons that we have very strict rules about poles and attachments. We have to design to the weather. They have to be designed so that there's an ice storm, there's a load factor that's built into this. So we have to be sure that everyone that's on those poles follows those guidelines. Preparation is key.
Yeah.
Making sure our generators, we test our generators every week in our switching offices, make sure they're all set. We have 24/7 monitoring on all of our equipment. We know when we lose power and arrow, and we can dispatch a technician up there while the equipment's still on battery. So preparation in advance of, we know when blizzards are coming pretty well now, so preparation is key.
Well, thank you, and to the Commissioner's point too, so is making sure that we're prioritizing power needs, kind of greatest bang for the buck in many ways. So I thank you all for those comments. I want to turn now to a little bit more of a discussion on the social and economic benefits of broadband. I think it's intuitive for many of us, but maybe I can start with you, Mr. Shepherd. You have long worked to connecting this state to broadband, and I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about some of the unique challenges our state faces in terms of deployment, and what are the social and economic benefits that accompany connectivity?
That's an interesting question. So from the connectivity side, I spoke to them in my testimony, really, that there are definitely challenges. I didn't say as part of the hearing today, but we literally had one provider that refused to move their cable plant, even though all of the pole attachment agreements say you need to do that. They just refused to because they didn't want the competition. So that was an extreme challenge for us. But it goes back to your previous question. It's a little ironic that we're talking about trying to expand broadband into rural America and unserved areas, but at the same time, we're asking the providers to make sure their network is resilient, and how do they prioritize
Right.
the funding between those two, because as Mr. Spellmeyer said, it's expensive. So I don't know if there's a great answer, and I think they just have to weigh that in their own business plans.
Well, and it may be that as we further these conversations, that Congress has to get involved too in identifying where we think investment should go and trying to help strike that balance with the industry. Mr. Strickland, I see you are interested in commenting.
Well, my own personal story, I think, is kind of an example of the social economic benefit. I was fortunate enough 20 years ago to be able to move to New Hampshire by choice. My family grew up in Oklahoma with the tornadoes. But I had a portable career and one that telecommunications allowed me to live wherever I wanted. And so we specifically chose New Hampshire as the place we wanted to be, and we've never regretted that. This is an amazing place. I eventually started a business here, and so I've got a number of families now that, you know, depend on what we're doing. And again, the internet makes that possible. So I think that, you know, recognizing that the New Hampshire advantage may be New Hampshire itself, it is an amazing place. It's a place that people want to live their lives. And broadband can really enable a lot of them to come here and be part of that experience. And, you know, you talked a moment ago about the Airwaves Act and, you know, what is that going to do in terms of devices. I think it's hard to envision the innovation that will occur once the infrastructure's in place. It's hard to see beyond the technology horizon, but I guarantee you there are a million good ideas out there that will blossom once the infrastructure's in place. People say, oh, I could do this. So I think we've got to build it, and they will come.
Thank you. Mr. Sear, do you want to comment on that? And then I'll come back to the others.
Sure. I think, like many things that we do, the first 90% of what we do is remarkably easy compared to the last 10% of getting it done, right? And so there are so many areas in our country where it's economically it's easy. The math is easy, the business plan is easy to serve populations, and you know, that's where it's time for the government to step up, is to help support the other areas of our country where we have that social obligation to make sure that's served as well. And it isn't just purely about the business fundamentals and economics to say whether or not a place should be served or not. And so I think it's critically important, you know, purely for that perspective. If you think about, you know, we want people to be moving up north. If people want to be, the people that are up north desperately need businesses to be formed up there. But if you're a business and you're trying to decide where you're going to be, you have two primary reasons to be there. Well, three. You could do it because you live here and you love it. But otherwise, it's all about, I'm going to be where my customers are, or I'm going to be where the talent is. And if the customers aren't going to be up north because they can't get access to the internet, or if the talent's not going to be up north because they can't get access to the internet, the businesses aren't going to follow. And it's a perpetual cycle. So sometimes it just needs to be jump-started. As we said earlier, remarkable things can happen once we get the infrastructure in place that can jumpstart and revitalize entire economics.
So you're really articulating here that the reality for new businesses and entrepreneurs, which is if there isn't good access to broadband, to connectivity, both for purposes of connecting to customers, but also attracting talent and giving talent the tools it needs to do the work, it's really a non-starter for those folks.
Sure, for many, many industries, right? And so I think you could pretty well guess in our North Country the industries that flourish up there and those that aren't present, and there's a good reason why.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, go ahead. Briefly, Senator, two things that come to mind for me. As you were asking the question, the law enforcement officer in the back of the room, his radio went off and he stepped out, and I think that's the best reminder for me of the importance of the basic level of connectivity. If we brought him back in the room, I'm sure he could tell plenty of stories about where it's still needed and why it's still needed, and we see that in Puerto Rico today. The second one is a health benefit. If you look at things like the Apple Watch that's on my wrist, they continue to make tremendous advances in terms of medical monitoring, the ability to pick up the fact that you're going into cardiac arrhythmia before you do. And we're not too far away from the point where I think that watch is automatically going to reach out and alert your doctor to the fact that it's going on. And you want to have connectivity when you do that. So there's just innumerable examples, and 5G will multiply it.
Yeah, and not to mention that when you have certain areas in the healthcare system where you have a shortage of providers, the capacity to do telemedicine is increasingly important, as it is for people who live far away from providers. And so one of the challenges we continue to consider here in New Hampshire is we'd like so many people in our rural areas to be able to access medicine through a teleconnection. And right now, that's an idea, but it is still very hard to actually make a reality because of our connectivity issues. Yes.
I'd like to add that, excuse me, the whole workforce development side and STEM pipeline is critical. I mean, we need this infrastructure to make sure that our kids are trained properly, have access to the tools they need, get rid of the digital divide, and have the workforce available for our New Hampshire companies. And then related to that, some of the work that our broadband, the D-N.H Broadband Mapping and Planning Program has done and is continuing to do as part of the Northern Borders Regional Grants is to hold workshops. We have one next Wednesday in Claremont that presumes if you already have access to broadband, are you using it properly? Do you know how to get yourself onto Yelp and make sure that when people are looking for restaurants, they know that you're there?
Right.
And so I think that's critical to expanding this.
Yeah, a very good point, and especially as we think about different ways to do workforce training, and people will need to probably update their credentials now on a regular basis in a very fast-moving digital economy. And the importance of being able to do that in a way and at a time that makes sense given people's busy lives is really increasingly important. I want to turn now to some of the local issues that were raised from folks in anticipation of today's hearing. And I recognize that the panelists may not have had the opportunity yet to read the written testimony that's been submitted, but I'd like to share some of what's been submitted from some folks in this part of the state. And I'll start with what we heard from State Senator Jay Kahn. He notes that it is estimated that 25% of Cheshire County, which is the county in which we sit right now, 25% of Cheshire County residents are unserved or underserved when it comes to broadband access. Senator Kahn relayed several stories from his constituents, one who needs broadband for their jobs and their livelihoods, and one family who subscribes to 2 DSL companies so that way they have a backup if one company's service is too slow on a particular day. Mr. Joshua Meehan, a Keene resident, also submitted written testimony in which he described at length his battle with a cable provider in trying to get broadband service for his home and his neighbor's home in Keene. For people in our state, a lack of affordable access to broadband continues to be a real and serious challenge, as some of these comments and testimony reflect. So I want to start just by talking with Mr. Spellmeyer and Mr. Reed. What's your message to the people in Keene and Cheshire County and other densely populated areas of our state? How can we attract companies like yours and others to provide high quality and affordable service? Who wants to go first?
I'll go ahead. So U.S. Cellular does serve Keene. We have a store here in town. We do our best to try to provide quality service. We continue to try to, we went from 3G to 4G quickly. We will try to go from 4G to 5G quickly. It's easier to go from one level to another than to bring that fundamental base service to an area, because you've got to construct a tower in order to do that. So the good news is for places where we're already at, the ability to upgrade comes quicker. And I think that's a...
It's not a Keene issue.
It's not, yeah, it's...
It's a and we'll, yeah,
Well, as I said, I saw it coming over, and it really, what we struggle with is if we're not there, we've got to figure out how to construct a tower, at, let's say, $400,000, $500,000, and then bring in backhaul, pay for that backhaul every month from a provider like Fairpoint. And it becomes a question of how many of those places can you go to in a given year. Prices in the wireless industry have fallen dramatically, which has hurt revenues. And it's just a really tough business equation to bring service beyond where it is today.
Well-
It's a density factor for us.
Right, and so, what we're hearing from residents of Cheshire County and in the North Country, and really even in other pockets of the state where people assume everything is well connected, is that even in dense areas, there are some barriers. I want to give Mr. Reed a chance to answer this too, and then I want to follow up with you all, because one of the questions that really your answers kind of help us focus on, I guess, is if the private sector can't, for some reason, get to everywhere it needs to get, then the issue of whether municipalities should be somehow empowered to becomes another question. So, Mr. Reed, why don't you start, and then we'll follow up on that issue.
Okay, we'll follow up on that issue.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really important to me. So I apologize, I did not have the opportunity to read the
Right.
testimony, but I do have a little bit of data here. I do want to just level set for a second, because it almost feels like we're sitting here saying everything is stagnant, what are we going to do? Broadband is improving every day, and construction's going on every day, and I don't want anyone to think that it isn't. So, and I'm just going to speak for my company, but my competitors as well. So, just improving broadband speeds from what it was, like 3 meg up to 25 meg, that's a technology issue. Technology has allowed us to do that. We've changed our technology for every CAF2 project and every remote we build, so that, if you're all the way out to the end of the line, like at 16,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 12,500 feet, you're going to get 10 over 1. If you're in closer, you're going to get up to 50 over 20. So I just want to make sure that work is going on, and while we're sitting here. So I just want to capture that. The federal government recognized Cheshire County. I actually, purely by accident, brought a piece of paper with me that might be helpful, but this is what the mapping showed, and this is what Fairpoint accepted, is in Cheshire County in New Hampshire, the CAF map, is the feds are going to support, the federal government, I'm sorry, is going to support 2,145 locations, and they felt that it was worth $566,000. So the federal government is putting that much money in, that we are going to build those locations, and some are in progress. I took a look at just what our projects are going on now. Since 2008, we've added 700 remote locations in New Hampshire, moving our switching equipment out closer to the customer to allow for broadband. But right now, we've got, say, 50 projects in the works. 22 of them are around the Monadnock area. A bunch more are in the North Country. That's no surprise. That's what showed up on the federal government's map. So there is work going on, Senator, and that work is going to continue. Mr. Spellmeyer and I were talking, it's really just money. So we have to make a business case. I am not a firm believer in build it and they will come. It's build it and let's figure out how we're going to get people to use it. Digital literacy is a key factor in how it will improve our business models. It will improve the private sector, and it'll get more people on the internet. So we need to include that too in our forecast.
Mr. Strickland wants to comment on this, so why don't we start with that, and then I'll follow up with it.
So, to the, commercial providers on this panel, they cited a number of times the need to, make the ROI case for build out, and that's perfectly understandable. I'm a businessman too. I think this is a case where, private enterprise doesn't necessarily work as well as we wish. And we've got a model that's been very, very successful. We have universal telephone service and have had for a long time. I don't think we can afford to treat broadband differently than that anymore. It was a luxury for a long time, but it isn't anymore. There are people now that have broadband that don't have a copper phone line.
Right.
And I think the time has come to treat this like the utility that it really is, and address it that way.
So that brings us to this question of if a service provider either, to put it one way, can't because the business model doesn't work for them, get out to that last mile of connectivity, or for some other reason refuses to, should municipal options be available? Anybody can answer that. I see Mr. Strickland is nodding.
Of course.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
talk about it simply because we have worked with so many municipalities on this issue in the 3 states, a couple hundred of them, Keene being one of them. And the very first thing we do is to map what Fairpoint has. We don't always know what our competitors have. We map what Fairpoint has, and I don't want to generalize, but I would say the vast majority of the groups we've spoken with, it doesn't need, it was municipal government, it may have been a group within the town that's trying to improve broadband, we're surprised by how much fiber is there, what speeds are available, and some cases, it's only a small piece of a town that they've decided they want to address. Or we can afford to address this, or what's it gonna cost to do this industrial park that we're planning. So education up front is really critical on how, before we just blanket say, yeah, it's a good idea to overbuild an existing network.
I do want to say that I think for people in this part of the state, people in the North Country, the notion that they should be worried about overbuilding right now would seem, I mean, I don't want to be, I mean, part of what we're dealing with here, and maybe in a moment we can talk a little bit more about broadband mapping, is that there does seem to be this ongoing different understanding of the level of connectivity for people in so many parts of our state. And it is of deep concern to me because I will often have one conversation with providers and industry about the levels of connectivity, and then I'm out, you know, I drive all over the state, and, you know, as governor, there were parts of the state where I would have to say to people, you're not going to be able to call me between X and Y because I'm going to be on Route 9. And so I want to perhaps just say that we should commit to each other to continue this discussion and really drill down on this issue. I'm seeing motion over here, and then Mr. Sear, do you want to go? And then Commissioner, I don't know if you had a comment, and then we'll go back down to Mr. Spellmeyer.
Great, thank you. I just add a little bit of color to both sort of the deployment side as well as the municipal interest in broadband. I live in Portsmouth. City Councilor is here in Portsmouth. My business, I'm actually a Fairpoint customer, disclosure, for fiber right now, and enjoy it and have for many years. Our business in the past has been a Fairpoint customer with gigabit internet speeds. We moved 2 blocks away and we're no longer able to be a Fairpoint customer for any speed that was going to be acceptable for our business, and we had to move providers. It's happened twice while I've lived in Portsmouth, just in broadband internet. Even though we have considerable, we have actually options in Portsmouth, which is unusual for many areas of the state. Even then, it's actually difficult for businesses and pay cancellation fees and all the other things that are related to that. Although it has not got up to the city council level, there have been discussions among residents and about this very topic of should we be looking at providing internet services on a municipal level. So I know it's even in places like Portsmouth, which have gigabit internet speeds in the city, for at least some places, it's still a conversation that's being had.
Thank you. Commissioner, and then Mr. Spellmeyer.
All right, I'm going to just try to take this up a level. I think there's no know-how like New England know-how that our forebears here, when we didn't have bridges, we didn't have roads, we didn't have barns, our communities came together and we figured out how to get things done.
Right.
And the truth is, I think with broadband, it is an expensive proposition in rural America. All the math is hard for financing, deploying, and operating these networks. But at the same time, I think it's fundamentally true that it is small d democratic that communities should be able to come together if they feel the private sector is passing them by and try to explore if they can do it for themselves. I think that's part of our history, and I think it should be allowed. The challenge is that there are many state laws that tend to prevent that from happening. So what bothers me about that is those communities don't even get the right to explore and have that conversation. And I think as a democratic community governance matter, it's something they should be allowed to do.
Thank you. Mr. Spellmeyer.
Just briefly on the issue raised before about mapping accuracy and multiple providers, it's one of my really hot button issues. What goes on with these maps when they make maps of where there is coverage and isn't coverage, particularly in the wireless industry, is, you know, you come to Keene and US Cellular's got coverage, and so they check off the map and they say Keene is done.
Right.
And then you go 4 counties to the north, US Cellular may not have any coverage there, and let's say AT&T does. Well, they check off that part of the map and they say, oh, job's done. The problem is, the only way as governor you experience traveling around the state is you have to carry a US Cellular phone and an AT&T phone and a Verizon phone in order to make your way across the whole state. And that gets completely ignored in this mapping process. It's been a problem. I tried to argue it to FCC Chairman Wheeler last year, and he looked at me and he said, don't go around telling people we need to get multiple phones from multiple providers. and I understand, and you probably won't appreciate me mentioning that, but it's the truth. You know, I'm carrying devices from 3 carriers. I live in Washington, D.C. I travel the whole country, and I need to do that in order to get connectivity, but that doesn't work for the average American. And somebody's got to carry that message to policymakers at the FCC.
Well, thank you, which is a very good segue into a question I was going to have on the whole issue of mapping. And Commissioner, the FCC is now responsible for maintaining the national broadband map. It's my understanding, though, that the agency hasn't updated that map in years. And so is the FCC taking this responsibility related to the map seriously, and how can we improve it? And I take it that your email site for for people to report in is part of your effort on
Sure.
this.
I think this is a big problem. You cannot manage problems you do not measure. Our maps are now 3 years out of date. More than that, I think most of us are familiar with that experience when we're told we have service and you're standing there and you're like, no, I don't.
Right.
I know that experience happens more in rural communities than anywhere else. So we're going to have to figure out how to make sure our maps operate at a level of precision that is meaningful to people on the ground. And so that's why we just set up an email inbox, broadbandfail@fcc.gov, because I think we have to start asking people to help us, asking people to tell us where they have service and where they don't. And you know, you can tell me that that's not the most scientific method. I think we're past the point, though. We're just combing over data in Washington conference rooms is the way to get this done. So we are going to try to suggest to everyone, and we're starting here with you, New Hampshire, that if you write us at broadbandfail@fcc.gov, we'll take your stories and aggregate them, and I will share them with my colleagues and see if we can use that to inform our next generation of data and mapping efforts.
Well, thank you. And that also, it's my understanding, too, that there is a lack of standardized reporting from different providers in terms of what qualifies as connectivity on the ground and what doesn't. Would that help as well if
You're
we
right.
were-
We are going to have to come up with digital age standardization for what we consider served and not served. I feel like we're working off of old analog era models.
Yeah.
We're going to have to do it with a level of precision that is new and different and more meaningful.
And thank you, Mr. Spellmeyer. And then
Yeah, Senator, if I could just say maybe a word of thanks to you and your colleagues in the Senate. 3-4 years ago, FCC staff prepared a draft order that had a whole bunch of conclusions in it about the fact that wireless coverage was everywhere in rural America. The job was done. We set about, we looked at it, we said, we know that's not true.
Right.
We set about fighting it, but I would say we made the most progress because if there were 100 people in this country that understood the problems that were actually going on the ground, it was the 100 members of the Senate. And on a bipartisan basis, you guys have made a lot of noise, and it's had a lot of impact in moving us in the right direction towards fixing that mapping, so thank you.
Well, and I will transfer the thanks to constituents of the 100 senators, because they're the ones who make sure we really know. Mr. Shepherd?
I just wanted to add that, sort of reinforce that reporting at the census block level is never going to cut it either. There's
Right.
such a gap there. And I don't know why in this day of big data, we can't have an online live database
Right.
that all the providers are required to respond to.
Well, that's a great idea. Mr. Strickland?
And I would just extend Commissioner's comment about, establishing some standards for service. As somebody who's in the role of acquiring service for a variety of different needs and at different levels, I would love to see, at least 3 levels of classification of service so that I could look at the map and know that, yeah, I can get service for this business. They don't need, a gigabit service, but they need reliable 50 megabit service.
Okay, thank you. I want to change the focus just a little bit to a more complete discussion of what the Commissioner has referred to as the homework gap. Commissioner, you have worked diligently to find ways of ensuring that our nation's students can access the internet to complete assignments and gain the social and economic benefits of being connected so that they compete in a global economy. You've coined the phrase closing the homework gap to refer to this endeavor. What are the greatest challenges and opportunities you see for us in being able to close the homework gap, and how can we better utilize the Universal Service Fund to do that?
Thank you. I appreciate you asking me about this. I think kids not being able to do their homework is probably the cruelest part of our digital divide.
Right.
It's necessary for success in school and in the economy right now. And so we should be pouring every resource we have to fix it. That includes universal service programs at the FCC that help with deployment and help low-income households getting connected. I think every way we can scrub those programs and see how they can help the homework gap is important. I also think we should consider how the E-rate program might be able to help fund wireless routers on school buses. Because in rural America, kids spend much more time on a school bus getting to school in the morning and going home at night. And if we turn that ride time into connected time for homework, that can make a big difference.
Yeah.
I also think communities can do a lot, because there are communities right now that are mapping the safe spaces they have for kids to do their homeworks. It might be a coffee shop or the library, but we've got some places where the hotel in town kicks in, or the big store decides that they'll set aside some connectivity that can be used by students. And if we can map those places as a community, I think that we will all contribute to solving this problem faster.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd, can you explain how New Hampshire has used federal support to build out broadband coverage in the state schools and work to close some of that homework gap?
Absolutely, and as you're aware, you created the New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative.
I really didn't plant that way, but
So you can pay me later, yes. But at the time, the Telecom Advisory Board and the governor's office were both looking at the same thing. We were doing a connectivity assessment of our schools. Again, you have to have the data to know where to go next. And you were approached by Education Superhighway. So we've been working collectively with them, and over the past 2 years, we went from 32% of our K through 12 schools not being connected down to 24%. And this year, we hope to connect the remaining 39 districts to get fiber. And it's all based on the E-rate program and making sure that those schools who have never filed E-rate before know that it's available. And as part of the New Hampshire SCI initiative and Education Superhighway, we got the state of New Hampshire to appropriate $4 million matching, which will be matched by the FCC E-rate program.
Great.
So we're cutting down the cost of the local community by doing that.
great. I will add that just one of the reasons that we ended up focusing the way we did in the governor's office on this, again, has to do with leadership at the community level, because one of the things You learn if you travel New Hampshire and visit a lot of schools, even in our very smallest towns way up north, you find that when they have cracked the conundrum of how to connect and get the right kind of speed, the educational opportunities that are then opened up to students in very small communities just are amazing. And so to walk into a classroom, as I've done in a very small town in the northern part of our state, and see students looking at scenes of Chinese urban areas in real time to begin to understand how the Chinese organize certain kinds of economies and other things was just really amazing, because these kids were getting real-time visuals from a part of the world that they would never be seeing in any other way. And so there are great examples throughout our state of what you can do, how you can leverage that connectivity for our students. And it was a real impetus for me to try to find ways to make sure that all students had that kind of access. And when you ask students, even at very young ages, what being connected means to them, they can articulate it incredibly well. Thank you for your work on that, and I look forward to continuing to work with you as we get the last group of schools connected.
Senator, could I have a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So there are two interesting things. So part of it's about getting connectivity to the school. We want fiber to all the schools. Part of it's education, because unfortunately we have run into some schools who have very low bandwidth and say it's perfectly adequate for what we need today.
Yeah.
So that's another scary place that we're trying to work on.
Yeah.
And then the other piece was that there are rumblings about some of the E-rate Modernization Act being rescinded.
Yeah.
And our New Hampshire Sci initiative was first about school connectivity, and then we were going to move into Wi-Fi in the schools to make sure that you could actually use that connectivity.
Right.
And I understand that that's in jeopardy. So whatever we could do to help with that, we
Yep.
certainly would do.
Well, and we have, a number of us in the Senate are very concerned that there may be a rescinding or elimination of the E-rate program and some restrictions on the other universal service programs. And so we have been advocating for the continuation of them, and we will continue to reach out to the public, because I think it's really important for the public to weigh in on how important connectivity is and how important the E-rate programs have been. The other thing that the superhighway program really helped with is it's not just about having the connectivity and getting the right speeds, it's also working with local school districts, for instance, so that they know how to get the best deal and how to understand what they should be paying, what's reasonable, what isn't. And that's where the expertise of people in your shop and the superhighway shop has been so important too. Anybody else want to comment just on the homework gap, or have any other thing to, Mr. Spellmeyer?
The only thing I was thinking of, I'm remembering last year, I know U.S. Cellular participated in a pilot project in the state of Maine to put the small wireless routers into the hands of schools, where they could be checked out in the library and taken home by students who needed it at home. And I recognize there are challenges with watching hundreds of hours of video, but there are other applications as well that kind of speed still works very well for. I know that some of your colleagues, including Senator King in Maine, was working on getting that funded in the education bill. And I've frankly lost track of where that ended up, but trying to expand those types of efforts.
Anyone else want to comment? Well, I wanted then to turn to the topic of direct spending here for broadband infrastructure. Commissioner, even with everything the FCC is doing with the Universal Service Fund, many believe that an additional infusion of direct funding is needed to close the digital divide and to make broadband access truly universal. Senate and House Democrats recently unveiled an infrastructure plan that included $40 billion in direct broadband infrastructure spending. Now, I'm still evaluating the plan, but Commissioner, do you agree that direct spending is necessary to eliminate the digital divide and to make broadband truly ubiquitous?
Yes.
That's a simple answer. I'll add to that just a
Yeah.
little bit and tell you that we have some places in this country that are at risk of falling behind.
Yeah.
By and large, they're rural. So the more funds that we can get to those communities to make sure that they are connected, and the faster that we can do that, the more likely they're going to be able to participate in 21st century economic success.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel want to comment on what direct investment in infrastructure would help us do?
Well, I certainly believe it's crucial. I think it was Mr. Strickland that talked about how we got basic telephone service out to everybody in this country, and that was a direct government investment to get it done. And the same thing is needed in the broadband area. And we strongly support any and all efforts, including the package that you referred to.
As do we.
Okay, thank you very much. We are getting close to the end of our time here. We wanted to wrap up by noon, and I'm going to ask one more question, and then if any of you have any closing thoughts, I'll ask for those. But the last topic I wanted to touch on today was about broadband speeds. Recently, the Federal Communications Commission requested public comment on a notice of inquiry which raises questions about whether mobile broadband can be substituted for fixed broadband. This would lower broadband speeds from the current standards by almost 2/3. It would have a devastating impact on rural Americans in New Hampshire and beyond for us to begin to say your mobile speed is the best that we're going to do, and rural America will just have to live with the speed that's 2/3 less than the rest of the country. Commissioner, what's your response to this notice of inquiry, and what would be the further impacts of replacing fixed broadband service with mobile across the country?
My response is that idea is crazy, and we'll tell you why. We need big bandwidth, and we need it everywhere. Right now, the agency has a 25 megabit standard, and if you've got a household with a few people in it who want to watch video, look some things up, you'll understand that's necessary. Rolling it back to 10 megabits doesn't make any sense. The future's bigger than that. I think our standard should be 100 megabits, because I think you have to set big goals if you want to do audacious things.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment? Mr. Strickland.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I may be the oldest one up here, and I remember starting my career on a 300 baud modem.
Yeah.
So I've come from a long way. I think that the ways that we consume bandwidth are growing very rapidly.
Yeah.
So you got to aim very high, and even that won't be enough. But certainly, 100 megabits is not at all unreasonable for home use. And I want to point out that when we talk about bandwidth, for home use, it's mostly downstream use. It's Netflix and so forth. For businesses, it needs to be symmetric.
Right.
So, I make the distinction between consumer grade and business grade bandwidth, as a business grade connection is a symmetric connection with low latency and an SLA, so that we know that it's going to work. Businesses need to be able to upload large amounts of data just as well as download it.
Right. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Spellmeyer.
One of the things that people lose track of is that there's already a law about this. It was in the Telecommunications Act. It requires that the commission work to ensure that consumers in rural areas have access to reasonably comparable services to folks in urban areas. And there certainly are plenty of folks in urban areas that are getting very high speed on wireline and wireless, and the law already says that it should be delivered to folks in rural areas, and frankly, regardless of cost. And so we're supportive of every effort to try to drive the speeds as high as possible.
Thank you.
If I could just add a bit of a note of caution. Broadband speed and everyone's definition of served and underserved is very wide. Upload speeds are becoming more and more important. If you take a look at the current CAF, or CAF 1 was 4/1. CAF 2 is 10/1. That's simply mathematics of how much we can get done for how much money. And I do not disagree with the commissioner. We're headed towards 100 meg. That's going to be extremely, extremely expensive. But our technology, everything is heading in that direction. Simple things like the example I had of going from 3 meg to 25 meg. No rocket science there. We added another remote, and the technology allowed us to do that. So the industry is moving that way. The needs of the consumer is moving that way, and we just keep on that path. But I'm very sensitive to people say, oh, you're building 10/1. The federal government has cast us aside. They don't know what we need out here. So we just have to be careful of our messaging, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd.
And I would just add to that, and it's what I had put in my testimony, that whatever federal funds, if we got $40 billion, that'd be a wonderful thing. We need to make sure that we put it towards the future technology and not keep expanding on copper-based technology. Utilize it and get the best of it we can. And I look at just D-N.H's services. So our wide area network in 2008, we were buying a half a gig of internet. We're now buying 40 gig of internet, and we have multiple 10 and 20 gig channels between our institutions.
Right.
So that ramp looks like this. That's going to be true for the consumers and the businesses as well.
Thank you, Mr. Sear.
So and this is for those that don't follow technology very well, we might think that technology growth goes along a traditional ramp like this, right? This is how we as humans think. The reality of technology adoption is an S-curve, as we just heard. It curves like this. And so we don't anticipate until it's way too late the radical change in demand, radical change in consumption. And so by doing something like this, it would be literally setting a tone which would enable even more of a digital divide. And it would be telling our residents, that they simply don't matter.
Well, I thank you for that. And one of the things that I think a lot about, too, is that looking towards the future, trying to make sure that we're building out for the technology that hasn't been created or refined yet is critically important. There's also a real potential, it seems to me, of recognizing real savings in terms of what the United States government does or what state governments do if we have the technology to get the kind of data we need that helps us make really important investment and programmatic and policy decisions. What programs work and what don't? Well, sometimes we don't really know that without data, and it's very hard for governments sometimes to get data if we don't have access to this kind of technology and speed. And so there is, just as there is a real value added for businesses now, and just as there's a really critical value in terms of the kind of innovation that we can spur if we have this kind of access to high-speed, high-quality broadband everywhere, there's also a real value, it seems to me, to government efficiency and decision-making moving forward. And so I think the investment that we're talking about really critical in any number of areas. And I have to tell you how grateful I am to all of you, not only for being here this morning and being willing to take so much time to talk about these issues, but also just in the work you do and in the leadership roles you've taken on in trying to make sure that we are addressing the connectivity issues that we are facing, which are, challenges, but, they're also obviously provide great opportunities for us moving forward. So do any of you have any further closing comments you'd like to make before we wrap up? Mr. Strickland.
I know that what we are hoping to accomplish here is expensive, on the order of $40,000, $50,000 a mile for fiber, sometimes more. I would point out that a mile of asphalt costs more than a mile of fiber. We don't hesitate to build asphalt roads.
Right.
We can solve this.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just quickly, I would like to say, I thank you for this. We need to talk about this, and we need to talk about it in this type of forum. Nice balanced forum. It was very helpful. We are really, I think, at the point of we need private-public partnerships, be it at the federal level or the state level or the municipal level. We had a partnership with a municipality here in New Hampshire, Molten Borough. very successful. So we're there. I think we can do this. I know we can do this. But thank you for this opportunity, and I hope we can get that awareness out there, Senator.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Well, I can't thank you enough, all of you again, for attending today and for the work you do. You know, one of the great privileges of sitting on the Commerce Committee too is learning about the emerging technologies that are so dependent on connectivity and access to high speeds. And so I'm excited by what's possible, but I am also continue to be concerned about having the infrastructure we need to leverage that emerging technology and innovation. So I'll continue to work on the issue. I thank everybody so much for attending today. The hearing record for this hearing will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon the receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. If there are people who are attending today or who see this during this open period, if it's replayed on video, and want to submit questions through my office, I can certainly then submit them to the witnesses. And you can contact my office. My central office in New Hampshire is in Manchester. We also have offices in Portsmouth, Berlin, Concord, and Nashua. So with that, I'll close the hearing and thank very much the witnesses again for your participation.
Thank you.